I'm Nicola Tallant, and you can listen to my brand new podcast, Beast, The Murder of Nora Sheehan, streaming now, wherever you get your podcasts.
So today we've heard the harrowing victim impact statements from Ashling Murphy's family, and also her boyfriend, Ryan Casey, which, I think at one point we have the headline in some of the papers, "May you rot in hell." And I think it really brings home the life-changing, devastating impact Jozef Puska's actions have had on Ashling Murphy and her family.
Yeah, so like we kind of said yesterday, this is the first time that the family actually got to speak about Ashling. It's the first time we've really heard about Ashling during the trial, and that's something her sister referenced in her victim impact statement, was the kind of the clinical nature of the criminal justice system and how victims, aren't centred as any part of that. So we did hear from Ashling's partner on the witness stand today. He brought up a picture of Ashling again onto the stand with him.
He read out his own statement.
Yeah.
Because obviously in many cases, the guards will sometimes read it out for people if they don't wish to do it themselves. But he obviously made the point and wanted to say this right in front of Jozef Puska, obviously.
Yeah, so it was highly emotional. I mean, I suppose Jozef Puska had an interpreter with him, and throughout the trial he's had the same interpreter who kind of spoke to him in kind of whispered Slovakian the whole way through, would just constantly kind of in her ear and straight out to Jozef Puska in Slovakian. But with this translator, he had a different one today, and she sort of wasn't whispering, she was speaking, and she was was waiting for somebody to finish, and then she'd summarise and tell him. So that kind of was a bit of a distraction for some of the victim impact statements. So for Ryan's in particular, there was a lot of high emotions in the room. I mean, he had that photograph of Ashling, the one we're all so familiar with, of her holding her violin, and he put that up on the stand, and that was there present for 3 victim impact statements. So it was himself. Her mother, Kathleen, gave a victim impact statement to the court, but that was read by a Garda. And then her sister, Amy, got up and gave kind of it was very poetic but very harrowing victim impact statement that she gave.
So just to read some of what Ryan Casey said, I mean, he described him, I think, as evil, evil, evil. He just said, "Because of you, I've lost my Ashling. Because of you, I will never get to marry her. Because of you, I will never hear her voice again. Because of you, I will never see her smile again. Because of you, I will have to carry on without her." I mean, it really, he referenced how Jozef Puska held himself as well, I think, and spoke about him maybe smiling and not showing remorse during the trial.
Yeah, I mean, that was the point in which kind of, at this point, the translator was still speaking to Jozef Puska. So at this point, he kind of shook his head as if to say no. He went through in detail his relationship with Ashling Murphy. He described that how they met each other. They were only going out for a year, and they decided to split up because they were, as he kind of joked, they were so busy being teenagers. And they eventually kind of rekindled the romance in 2016. So they'd been together ever since. He described the last moments that he saw her, which was on the 10th of January, the day before she died, and he spoke about how she had brought groceries to his family home because they all had COVID, or there was COVID in the house and they couldn't leave. And he sort of thought that he said that he frequently thinks back on regret of that day, that he just didn't give her a hug, or didn't hold her, and didn't let go of her. He spoke a lot about their dreams and their hopes for the future. It emerged that they had been, a few days later they were due to fly to Manchester together, and they had plans to move to Dubai for a few years, where Ashling really wanted to teach. The week that she died, they were due to meet up with an architect to discuss the plans for their home.
And you see, this is what a lot of people who are victims of, who are in relationships with victims of crime, whether it's family or romantic relationships, this is what they're left with after a murder. They're left with this kind of feeling of guilt, despite their absolute innocence and the fact that they couldn't have done anything. I mean, we heard that last week, of course, with the Jason Corbett's kids. How they're left with that feeling that they could have done something, and it's really, really, some of that comes true, and it's in a way people's lives freeze at the moment that crime is committed, and Absolutely. That's kind of what he is describing there.
Absolutely. I mean, her sister did speak about that as well, how Ashling was so selfless and how she did everything for everyone, and yet they felt such guilt because they weren't there to hold her hand or wipe her tears in her final moments. And as well, that kind of freezing that moment in time, you know, Ashling's sister Amy opened up her victim impact statement talking about how their job as children was to set the table for 5. She kind of referenced that throughout, that they set the dinner table every day for 5 people, and they still do that. There was a moment as well where she spoke about, I think it was her mother actually had mentioned that evening after Ashling Murphy had died, her uncle was in the house and went to light the fire, and he opened up the oven and found her dinner from that day in there. And all those kind of things, those little moments, you know, they're stuck in time for the family. And I suppose it's all those little things that make up their part of their grief for Ashling that we haven't necessarily had the chance to hear about yet, that this has had such a domino effect on not just Ashling as the victim, but her family, and the kind of the outward spread of that ripple of devastation that he's caused.
What it tends to do, and I suppose it's trauma really, but it just freezes people's lives in that moment. Like if you have an elderly relative maybe that dies of natural causes, it's a different type of thing.
Absolutely.
But that kind of violent act, particularly with somebody so young, they're just left with a before and an after. And the family will always carry that.
Yeah.
Obviously today, Jozef Puska is sentenced to life in prison. You know, that means he'll be in prison for the foreseeable future. But there is a reality that he will at some point get out again. He may be free to leave the country or whatever he wants to do. And her family, of course, are not going to be able to do that. Now, her mother didn't speak directly to court, as you said, but there was a statement read out on her behalf. What did she have to say?
Yeah, so she kind of spoke about Ashling and her memories of her. She described her as somebody who loved music and fashion. She said the house was always alive with the music that she played with her fiddle. And it was something that she loved passing on to her younger students. Again, she kind of spoke about how Ashling's life was so vast and busy, and it was filled up with, you know, work, with school. It was something that she had such a huge passion for, and it gave her a purpose in life. And she spoke about how she misses going to Ashling's matches. She was a camogie player, and as well as her concerts, she was major part of the traditional Irish music circuit in Ireland. She spoke about how Ashling was the chief organizer in the house. She often organised to take her sister and her mother out on spa days and holidays. She took them to different places. She actually, the week before she died, they went to the Guinness Storehouse as a family gift that Ashling had got them. She spoke about how she loved catching up with her family. She wasn't the sort of person that you could row with. She just was so lovely. And her boyfriend Ashling said that, or her boyfriend Ryan said that as well, that he had never really rowed with her or bickered. And it was just a testament to their love and respect that they had for each other and the kind of person that Ashling was. She kind of spoke about how Ashling was the dream teacher that any child's parent could hope for their child to have. There was a huge kind of conversation, or a huge mention of the fact from everyone that spoke about the impact of Ashling's death, how their motivation in life is just gone. They feel like they've got nothing to live for. They've spoke in depth as well about the trauma that they've experienced in terms of those lasting effects of such a violent crime, having nightmares, fear of going outside, hearing Ashling screams. Ryan had spoken about how he can't even look at knives anymore. He can't watch anything with a bit of violence in it. He has to use a knife to cook it or to eat his dinner or whatever, but after that it has to be taken away from him because his mind just spirals, he says, into these horrible places.
So, I mean, these are very, like, when you're listening to that as a neutral who never met Ashling Murphy or don't know her family as such, it's still very emotive. Like, I mean, it's Absolutely. Very hard not to be moved as a person sitting there. And what about Jozef Puska? Did he seem to react? There was more reactions from him today than I think throughout the whole trial. There was reference to him smirking and laughing throughout evidence.
Her sister Amy mentioned how when Dr. Sally Alcollis was reading the post-mortem, she said that he seemed to be smirking and laughing and almost enjoying hearing the brutal detail of it again. She spoke about how Jozef Puska kind of controlled not just Ashling's death, but the aftermath. She said that they couldn't even hug her or touch her. They had to spend less time with her as the days went on in the mortuary because she hadn't been embalmed in case the defence needed to carry out their own post-mortem on her body. I mean, there was a point where he was kind of, where he was kind of shaking his head. Before Amy got on the stand, she had said to Mr. Bowman, so the defence counsel, and asked him if he could maybe ask the translator to stop speaking because she was speaking rather than whispering and it was very distracting. So she had asked for that. So Jozef Puska didn't hear the full emotion and the full impact of what Amy had to say. I don't know if that's going to be read to him at a later date, but when Amy specifically turned around to look at him, at that point she did try and begin translation again, but was soon stopped. But he was shaking his head at the idea that he was smirking and joking. He also kind of seemed surprised by the fact he was being handed down a life sentence. It was almost like he was shocked and couldn't believe it. I mean, even at the start, and again, I don't know if this was a case that he decided, well, I'm going down for this now, so I might as well, bask in the notoriety of it or not, but he seemed to be kind of laughing and smirking to himself before the court even began, which I hadn't seen in him before. But he was a lot more reactive than he had been previously.
So in the sentencing hearing, initially the judge will have opened it up. He went through some of the evidence again, to give a kind of a legal opinion. Obviously, a jury make a decision. They decide guilty or not guilty, but they don't give a reason necessarily, I suppose. They don't sum up the evidence. So the judge did do that in the aftermath of this conviction. And he basically had another he had a go really at the defence as it was put forward, not obviously as instructed by Jozef Puska clearly. Saying, in particular, he spoke about some of the key defence claims, one of them being that Jozef Puska wasn't in a position to be interviewed by Gardaí in the hospital. He sort of basically said that the world is imperfect and the guards, came in good faith and they got this comment. What else did the judge kind of focus on? Yeah, so
I'd say he spent about an hour and a half going through the evidence again. He spoke about the admissibility of, there was kind of these issues that kind of were raised in the pre-trial, and he spoke about those. So he spoke about the admissibility of the CCTV, and he said that there is, a scale of privacy, and, the bottom of that scale is, CCTV in this case, which is just people going about their everyday lives. They're walking,
this is a defence now
on a car.
That Fat Freddie Thompson, for example, put up. That, he's just walking along the streets and the state have no right to collect all this information about him. I mean, it's been tried again and again in court, and it's nearly always rejected on the basis that, if you're investigating a murder, that right sort of supersedes a normal person's right to not be monitored by the state.
Exactly, yeah. And he kind of said that as well, that there was kind of a fatigue about having to kind of go over this again and again. But he also he did mention on the other scale of that, the right to privacy in a public place in particular. He mentioned a footballer that had a medical emergency on the pitch, and at that point, there's 50,000 people, the media are watching. At that point, even though it happened in public, he would still have a right to privacy because it was a medical emergency. So he did say there was that difference there, and he also said, the only kind of people who would have these specific interests in the right to privacy would be people, he says, that are kind of nuts about the authority of the state agencies and the surveillance state and stuff like that. But he said, usually when it comes to, in the hypothetical situation, if it was a family, and they would never say, don't look at her phone or don't look at CCTV to find them, because the right to privacy is more important than them being found. So he was trying to just explain it in that way.
Point. And obviously,
exactly.
The investigating a murder is a hugely important thing.
Absolutely. He also kind of went into those statements that were given in hospital, and he did say that, while yes, it may have been in a perfect scenario, they would have recorded the admissions, but again, it wasn't an interview. It was only kind of when they were executing the warrant. That in an ideal world, yes, they could have recorded it, but he said also the chance of those being being brought through dragged through that pre-trial process to see whether or not they were admissible in court. That would have been another thing that they would have had to go through, even if they did record it.
Yeah.
And he did kind of mentioned that they did have this independent witness, and he was satisfied that the independent witness was consistent and clear and concise in what they were saying and confident, and that independent witness was the translator who Jozef Puska specifically told to translate his words exactly.
Yeah, he's a neutral party if you want.
Exactly.
He doesn't gain anything by telling anything other than the truth. So I suppose all of this, the judge's summations do become relevant if there is an appeal. Was there anything else that he focused on in particular?
The only other thing kind of that he mentioned was, you know, when he was given his kind of summary of notes at the end, he did want to say certain things so that they could be brought into consideration in terms of parole, etc. down the road. He said that Ryan's statement, so Ryan had said, you know, it was unfair that Jozef Puska was only getting a life sentence, and in this country it wouldn't even be 23 years, the 23 years of life that Ashling Murphy had. He kind of mentioned that was the law, that was the way it is. However, he did wish that there was some cases where it could be considered. He did mention, obviously in the UK you have the option of handing down a whole life tariff, and he did express his wishes for that in the future. He also said that he wanted to note, for the sake of the life, or for it being
when he comes
a life sentence, for when he comes around for appeal, that he doesn't know why Jozef Puska did what he did, but he wanted to note that the question of his return to society, unless he's old and frail, needed to be really reconsidered.
So, I mean, this is what you see is the difference maybe between if Jozef Puska pled guilty and explained why he did what he did. That becomes part of the rehabilitation because he's taken responsibility for his actions. He then maybe could look at it in terms of, you know, undergoing therapy or whatever. And then the state can say, well, this person has done this heinous thing. However, you know, he's shown signs of rehabilitation. Jozef Puska has shown none of that.
No.
By putting the family through what really was a pointless case.
Yeah.
They've spoken about the trauma even then. And I suppose what the judge is saying is, without him making admissions, how can you be sure of his rehabilitation? And you can't. I mean, he's also referencing there probably in the UK where people get life sentences in the same way, but they can get a minimum sentence as well, or as you said, they can get a whole life term where they're not ever meant to come out again, but they can also say get a life sentence with a minimum serving of 30 years, for example. And that's not available in Ireland. However, it is under discussion, and it may well become available where you could give a minimum tariff with the life sentence. And I think it's something that certainly you hear Ryan Casey there, he's certainly putting that out there, that would be something that would ease their mind, because of course Jozef Puska is quite young, and you know, who would want to see him on the streets as a man in his mid-50s? Certainly very much capable of dangerous actions then.
Absolutely. I mean, and especially without that admission and without that remorse for what he's done. I mean, I suppose, how can you help somebody who's not admitting that to them? Maybe he's not even admitting to himself that that's what he did. I mean, and you can't therapize somebody like that unless they're willing and engaging.
Exactly. I mean, there's no point sending people to therapy unless they want to do it, you know. So he was taken away in terms of an appeal. There was probably no mention of it either way, was there?
No mention of an appeal, no. I mean, it is probably assumed that he will try and appeal a sentence. I will note as well, like, there was... none of his family were actually in court today, and had been mentioned by Amy that she did wonder how his family could even look at him. There was numerous mentions, and rightfully so, branding him as a monster and evil. You know, Ashling's sister, you know, mentioned, we gave you an Irish welcome and you repay the country by taking away somebody so young and loving and loyal. And it was a heartbreaking listen. There was a lot of emotion in the court. I seen at least one of the jurors that I remember from being there was back to hear the sentencing. The family left the court to an eruption of applause. Ashling's, I believe her father, who was sitting right behind me, called him a bastard, rightfully so, as he was being taken away. And there was a lot of, I suppose at this point, there was more anger towards Jozef Puska, I would say, as opposed to that heartfelt emotion and sadness that was felt throughout the trial.
Yeah, because I mean, look, he's taken the most destructive route for that family. possible.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's no, whatever, the act of itself is unforgivable, but he's taken the most unforgivable route as well. I mean, it's a very harrowing case. It's really moved a lot of people, and it's whether we see an appeal or not, of course, people have a right to appeal any case. That's part of the judicial system.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately for the family, it puts them through it all again if he does. And we can hope that he would maybe have listened to them today and not go down that route.
Yeah, I mean, we can only hope, but only time will tell.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Clodagh.
Thank you, Niall.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.